Hello, everyone. I got a special Christmas treat for you. This story is called An Etherverse Christmas Carol. I hope you enjoy it.
Prologue. Jacob Marley was dead, though not the proper sort of dead. Oh, they buried a corpse, signed all the correct documents transferring sole ownership of Scrooge and Marley to Ebenezer Scrooge, and some members of the business community even commented on it for a day or two. But unlike a properly dead man, Jacob Marley's soul remained tethered to the mortal realm. After decades of evil as a living man, he was now free to continue committing acts of evil as a lich. Martin Fezziwig stood in a poorly maintained graveyard on a biting December afternoon, surrounded by the indifferent silence of the stones. Fog clung to the ground, heavy and wet, obscuring his boots and swirling around the base of the monuments like a slow, spectral tide. The sun fought to show its face and failed miserably, managing only to make a slightly brighter spot in the leaden sky. The cold gnawed at the seams of his heavy wool greatcoat, seeking warmth to steal. Martin kept his hands thrust deep into his pockets as he stared fixedly at the lie carved in granite. 7 years had worn the headstone a fraction, though the inscription remained clear. Jacob Marley. The carver had chiseled the letters deep, as if demanding respect from the worms. Died, Martin snorted at that, December 24th, 1836. 7 years ago today his body went into the ground. A pity his cursed soul remained free to work mischief in the mortal realm. Tonight, Martin meant to put an end to that. Tonight, he'd finally finish his father's work. A gust of wind rattled the skeletal branches of a nearby yew tree, sending a few dead leaves skittering across the frozen ground. The air tasted of soot and snow, the mundane scents of a London winter. He withdrew a hand from his pocket and ran a gloved finger over the top of the headstone. The freezing granite tried its best to suck the heat right through the leather. Martin felt no hum of power here. Marley hadn't been foolish enough to leave his soul gem, his phylactery, buried in a public cemetery. That would have been too easy. No, the old miser had tucked his immortality away somewhere safe, likely guarding it with the same parsimonious jealousy he'd applied to his guineas. Martin turned his collar up against the chill. The empty graveyard held nothing save lies and bad memories. Pressing business in America had kept him away from his home city and the unfinished family business waiting for him. But, assuming heaven stood with him and matters worked out as he hoped, he would take the first decisive step toward seeing a true end to the sorcerer. He turned his back on the stone and made the short walk to the iron gates which marked the entrance to the cemetery. He pushed them open, ignoring the screech of the hinges. Old Scrooge had chosen this graveyard for his late partner, not for the quality of the maintenance, but the cheapness of the plot. No doubt Marley would have approved. Martin checked his pocket watch. 3:30. Fred would be leaving his office in half an hour, and Martin wanted to have a chat with him before he got home. If he wanted to finish with Marley once and for all, and save Scrooge's life in the process, he would need the young man's help. Chapter 1. The heavy oak door of Scrooge and Marley's counting house closed behind Fred Hollywell with a final, definitive thud on his uncle's snarled, "Humbug!" The fog, a dense yellow-gray shroud that clung to the shoulders of his greatcoat and purled in his hair, immediately swallowed the noise. He faced a proper London winter's evening, the sort that crept into a man's bones and settled there for a long stay, a damp and persistent chill that no amount of good cheer could banish. Fred hunched his shoulders and turned up his collar, the raw wool scratching against his jaw. Distant sounds, the faint, tiny melody of carolers, the solemn toll of a church bell marking the hour, were blunted and distorted by the clinging mist, reaching him as ghostly echoes. Gas lamps created hazy spheres of weak, jaundiced light that did little to pierce the obscurity. The small islands in the ocean of gray gloom gathered men and moths both. His breath plumed before him, and he shivered. Winter had barely started, but if tonight gave any indication of the future, it would be a particularly long season. Fred began the trudge home, his boots striking a hollow rhythm on the flagstones. Dejection made a familiar companion on Christmas Eve. The weight of failure settled upon him each year after this particular pilgrimage. He replayed the conversation, as he always did, on his walk home. The words felt foolish as they echoed in the cold silence of his memory. He'd spoken them with such earnest warmth, a genuine hope that this year, the frost that coated his uncle's heart might finally thaw. But the reply had been the same as ever, a cudgel of a word meant to batter his goodwill into submission. Bah! Humbug! He could have pressed harder, perhaps. Could have ignored the bookkeeper, Bob Cratchit, shivering in his corner, pretending not to listen. Fred imagined a different scene, one where he didn't retreat so easily. Perhaps he could have spoken of his mother, Scrooge's late sister, Fan. Would a reminder of her gentle spirit have pierced the old man's armor? Or would it have only caused the armor to be thickened, the barbs to be sharpened? He pictured his uncle's face, a pinched and sour mask of disapproval, the lines around his mouth carved by years of scowling at the world. And yet, beneath it, Fred always thought he saw something else, a flicker of pain, a deep and profound loneliness so deep he found it almost terrifying to behold. That flicker kept him coming back, year after year. Not duty, not merely tradition, but the stubborn, foolish hope that he might one day offer a hand and find it taken. He shook his head, a small, frustrated motion. It was useless to dwell on it. His wife would be waiting, the house filled with warmth and the smell of roasting meat, a stark and welcoming contrast to the bitter chill of his uncle's office and the even colder chill of his heart. The thought brought a small measure of comfort, and he quickened his pace, his mind on the pleasant evening that awaited him. Lost in these ruminations, his gaze fixed on the slick cobblestones just ahead of him, he failed to notice the solid dark form that materialized from the fog until it was too late. He stumbled, catching himself just before a full collision, his shoulder banging against the other man's. "Oh, good heavens, I'm so terribly sorry," Fred stammered, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He reached out a hand to steady the stranger, though the man seemed perfectly balanced. "Forgive me, sir. My head was completely elsewhere. Are you quite all right?" The man stood easily 6 feet tall and was dressed in an impeccably tailored greatcoat of dark, sensible wool. He wore no hat despite the chill, leaving his dark hair slightly damp from the mist. His face bore a serious, determined expression that gave his sharp and intelligent features a stern air. He regarded Fred with a steady, unblinking gaze that held neither warmth nor hostility. "No harm done," the stranger said. His calm, even tone matched his expression. "The streets are treacherous this evening." Indeed, Fred said, still flustered by his own clumsiness. "I should have been watching my path in any case." He made to step around the man and continue on his way, but the stranger did not move. "You are Mr. Fred Halliwell, are you not?" Fred stopped, surprised. "I am." "Have we met, sir? I confess your face is not familiar to me." "We have not," the man replied. "My name is Martin Fezziwig." The name struck Fred with the force of a physical blow. Fezziwig. He hadn't heard anyone mention that name, save in relation to the famous importer of tea and spices, in years. His Uncle Ebenezer had spoken of his first employer, on very rare occasions, long ago, with a tone that sounded almost fond. A ghost of a smile would touch the old miser's lips as he recalled the Christmas parties, the food, the dancing, the sheer, unadulterated joy of his apprenticeship under old Mr. Fezziwig. They were the only happy stories Fred had ever heard from him. Fezziwig. Fred's eyes widened. He stared at the man, truly seeing him now. "Are you by any chance related to the Mr. Fezziwig who ran the famous import and export house?" A slight, Almost imperceptible softening occurred around the man's eyes. "He was my great-uncle. I own the business now, though my manager oversees most of the day-to-day affairs." "Astonishing," Fred said. "My uncle, Ebenezer Scrooge, served as his apprentice many years ago. Well, he has always spoken of your great-uncle with the greatest respect and affection. He called him the finest master a young man could ever hope for." Martin Fezziwig smiled. "Uncle Nicholas had a gift for life. I'm glad your uncle remembers him kindly." He paused and, as if coming to a decision, said, "It's your uncle, in fact, that I came to see you about." Fred's excitement tempered as his natural caution kicked in. At first he thought perhaps Martin wanted to use him to convince his uncle to give him money, but he dismissed the idea as soon as it formed. Fezziwig Import-Export dwarfed Fred's own modest business, and even made Uncle Ebenezer's look small. No, whatever Martin wanted, it couldn't be money. "My uncle, you do realize the two of us aren't especially close. Perhaps it would be best to approach him directly." "I considered that," Martin said. "But, having seen him on several occasions at the exchange, I doubt a discussion about non-financial matters would interest him." Fred winced. He certainly couldn't find fault with Martin's analysis. His curiosity roused, Fred said, "Very well. Since I left work early, my wife won't be expecting me for another hour." "Splendid." Martin glanced around the empty, fog-bound street. "But perhaps we might find a more agreeable place for our chat." "There is a small coffee house just round the corner," Fred said. "It will be quiet this evening, I should think. We can have a private table." "Perfect. Please lead the way." Martin gestured for him to go ahead. Fred turned his back to the biting wind and guided Martin down the street toward the warm glow spilling from the shop's frosted window panes. He had no idea what his new acquaintance might have to discuss, but from the way the man carried himself, he suspected it would be interesting at minimum. Chapter 2. Fred led the way down a narrow lane, the cobblestones slick with grime that gleamed in the hazy light of a distant gas lamp. "The coffee shop isn't far." Martin made no comment as he fell into step beside him. The man carried an air of seriousness about him that slightly unsettled Fred. He sensed no malevolence about his new companion, just a focused purpose greater than most men he knew. A small, bow-fronted window lit by warm amber light appeared out of the gloom. Carved letters above the door announced it as the Turkey's Head. Fred pushed the door open, and a small bell chimed, its sound bright and clear after the muffled silence of the street. A wave of warmth and the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans washed over them. A deep breath cleared the odd air that had gathered around Fred since he left his uncle's counting house. The coffee shop was a long, narrow room, paneled in dark wood that had absorbed the scents and secrets of a century. Only a handful of tables had occupants, all men, most of them older than Fred, sipping from steaming cups. A server with a weary face and an apron stained by the ghosts of 1,000 spills looked up from wiping a nearby table, her expression bright. "Sit wherever you like. I'll be over to take your order in a moment." "Thank you." Fred led Martin to a small table tucked into an alcove, partially shielded from the rest of the room by a tall, lacquered screen. They shed their greatcoats, hanging them on the provided brass hooks. Fred felt 10 pounds lighter without the jacket weighing him down. They sat opposite one another on simple, hard-backed chairs. The marks of countless mugs and elbows left the table's surface dark and scarred. Fred felt a sudden acute sense of social awkwardness. Though he usually had no trouble talking with people, Martin's intensity seemed to discourage casual topics. The server arrived to take their order. "A cup of Earl Grey for me," Fred said. "And for you, sir?" the woman asked Martin. "The same, with 2 scoops of sugar." She hurried away to fetch their drinks, leaving them alone with the awkwardness. Fred cleared his throat. So, Mr. Fezziwig, you said you wished to speak with me about my uncle. Martin didn't answer immediately. He watched Fred with unnerving stillness. Fred felt the man could see straight through to his soul. The silence lingered until the woman returned with their order. When she'd gone for good, Martin asked, "Do you have any knowledge of the occult?" Fred blinked. The question lay so entirely outside the realm of what he'd anticipated that he could only stare stupidly as his brain tried to make sense of it. At last he said, "The occult? No, I can't say that I do. My wife has attended a few seances. It's become quite the fashion in some circles, you know. Table rapping and communicating with the dear departed. I confess I find the entire business rather silly. A parlor game for lonely widows, if you'll forgive my saying so." His smile faltered and died under Martin's unyielding gaze. "The occult is many things, Mr. Hollywell. A parlor game to some, a deadly serious business to others. But I assure you, it is never silly." Martin placed his mug on the table and leaned forward. The small sound seemed to echo in the quiet corner. "I have not come to discuss table rapping. I have come because a very real and very dangerous sorcerer has set his sights on Ebenezer Scrooge." Fred's hand, which had been halfway to his mug, paused. The easy, if awkward, atmosphere of the encounter had evaporated, replaced by something tense and deeply strange. His polite interest melted into confusion. "I don't understand. Sorcery is the stuff of storybooks. Surely you're not serious." The coffeehouse grew quieter by the moment. One of the other patrons settled his bill and departed, the bell above the door marking his exit into the fog. Martin paid the others no mind, his attention fixed wholly on Fred. He leaned closer, his voice low and hard. "I assure you I am as serious gets. Do you remember your uncle's partner? The man whose name is still on the sign above the door?" "Jacob Marley? Of course I remember him. He died on this very night, 7 years ago. A miserable old sinner, if you'll pardon my speaking ill of the dead, though a good man of business, if my uncle is to be believed. What about him?" Martin's dark, intense eyes never left Fred's face. "Jacob Marley is dead, but not in the way decent men understand it. His body lies in a cheap plot, but his soul, his will endures. Your uncle's partner, Mr. Hollywell, was a necromancer, a sorcerer of considerable skill and boundless malice. When my father finally cornered him and struck the fatal blow, the victory rang hollow. His body died, but his hate-filled soul found a new home." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter's night ran through Fred. Necromancer, sorcerer. These were words from Gothic novels and penny dreadfuls, not words spoken in a respectable London coffeehouse about a man who had been a known figure on the exchange. He stared at Martin, searching for some sign of a jest, some flicker of humor that would tell him this was all an elaborate, if tasteless, prank. He found none. Fred tried to speak, but found his throat too dry. He took a sip of tea to moisten it and buy himself a moment to think. "How do you know of such things?" "My father," Martin said. "I told you he struck the blow that slew Marley's body. He fought a silent, invisible war against Jacob Marley for years, since before he became your uncle's partner. He thwarted many of the monster's schemes over that time. Eventually, my father died on an unrelated mission. When he did, the duty to pick up where he left off fell to me. Imagine my horror when I learned that Marley's soul survived and he retained his ambitions with regard to Ebenezer Scrooge." Fred's mind reeled and fought hard against a rising urge to flee this madness. "Martin, clearly unhinged, must suffer from some elaborate delusion. It was tragic, of course, but Fred wanted no part of it. He had problems enough of his own without getting entangled with a madman. Fred began to stand. "This is impossible. It is well that you didn't try and approach my uncle. He would have laughed you out of his office. I'll say good evening to you, sir." Martin Fezziwig leaned back, the motion slow and deliberate. The old chair creaked under his weight. His expression did not change. He showed neither anger nor offense. If he told this sort of story to people regularly, no doubt he'd received a similar reaction before. "I suspected you wouldn't believe me," Martin said. "Most men refuse to believe in the magical world until it comes knocking on their door. I won't stop you from leaving, but know this. The magical world is about to knock on your uncle's door. If you wish for him to survive to see another Christmas morning, helping me is your and his only chance." Fred stood frozen between the chair and the table. His rational mind screamed at him to walk away from this lunatic's tale. And yet, he couldn't shake the earnestness in Martin's eyes, the utter conviction that spoke not of madness, but of a terrible truth he was forced to bear. Fred sank slowly back into his chair. The cold logic of reality warred with what he understood in the depths of his soul to be the truth. A long moment stretched, thick with the scent of coffee and the weight of an impossible decision. Finally, Fred let out a long, slow breath and looked Martin directly in the eye. "What do you want me to do?" Martin Fezziwig's face relaxed a fraction. "Meet me at 11:30 tonight across the street from your uncle's home, and pray we have the strength to save both your uncle and possibly the city." Chapter 3. Martin stepped out of the coffee house. The bell above the door gave a final farewell before the fog swallowed the sound, just as it swallowed the amber light spilling from the window. He'd leave Fred to his tea and thoughts for now. He'd need time to accept that reality encompassed far more than he'd believed an hour ago. The cold settled on Martin again, drawing a shiver. He walked, his boot heels striking a solitary rhythm on the slick stones. The mist deadened the world, reducing the sprawling immensity of London to a series of ghostly vignettes, a gas lamp haloed in yellow gauze, the dark shape of a carriage rumbling past like a phantom hearse, the fleeting glimpse of a face in a lit window. He considered the man he had just left. Fred Hollywell struck him as a cheerful, earnest, and kind man, exactly the sort of man he hated to drag into this world of darkness and magic, and, paradoxically, exactly the sort of man who could make a difference in it. Marley would attempt to manipulate Scrooge using his fear, regret, and despair. Fred, as Ebenezer's only living relative, should serve as a natural antidote to those poisons. Should being the most important word in that sentence. Clearly, Fred didn't hold a warm place in the old man's heart despite his status as sole living relative. Martin hunched his shoulders and picked up his pace. He could only do his best with the tools at his disposal. And, speaking of tools, he needed to prepare the items they'd need to complete tonight's mission. A 15-minute walk brought his hotel, a gaunt, brick-faced building on a street of other, equally anonymous structures, into view. Despite his considerable wealth, Martin avoided the really nice places when on a job like this. He needed no one questioning his comings and goings. This place promised nothing save a roof and a locked door, and he required nothing else. He pushed open the heavy front door and entered a small, dimly lit lobby that smelled of damp wool and coal dust. Behind a scarred wooden counter, a clerk looked up from his ledger, his eyes magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles. The man offered a slight, professional nod of recognition. Martin paused at the desk. He had no expectations of a letter. But he had other irons in the fire, and his trusty butler knew where to find him should anything of consequence come up. "Any messages?" Martin asked.
"Yes, sir. A letter arrived for you several hours ago."
The clerk reached into a cubbyhole and produced a single crisp envelope sealed with dark red wax. "Thank you." Martin took it and checked the seal. The stylized F confirmed the source, and it didn't appear anyone had tampered with it. He didn't linger in the lobby. A narrow, creaking staircase brought him to the second floor where his room waited. He unlocked the door and stepped inside the plain and unwelcoming space, finding everything as he left it. A single bed with a thin mattress, his trunk resting at its foot, a small writing desk and a hard-backed chair, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. There were no pictures on the water-stained walls, no rug on the bare floorboards. He hung his greatcoat on a hook by the door and sat at the desk, letter in hand. Now to see what his butler, Preston, wanted. He wouldn't have written for anything less than an urgent matter. Martin slid a small knife from his pocket, sliced the seal, and unfolded the solitary sheet of paper. It seemed a church representative visited the estate. The Stella Maris, a merchant vessel carrying an artifact vital to his work, was overdue and presumed lost. A Danish frigate had found wreckage off the Dogger Bank. All signs indicated that the ship had been taken by pirates. No survivors. Martin's jaw clenched and relaxed. He'd spent months conversing by post with a smug, holier-than-thou bishop who had never left Vatican City, yet felt free to denigrate those who actually fought evil face to face. And now, when he'd finally convinced the man to send him the coffer of purification, the artifact ended up in the hands of pirates too stupid to realize its true value. If the bastards melted it down for the gold, he would be most displeased. He forced himself to relax. The pirates could be hunted later. The coffer could, perhaps, be recovered, but that problem would keep for another day. For now, he had a lich to slay and a miser to save. Martin burned the letter in the fireplace, watching until nothing remained. Though the letter contained no great secrets, he'd gotten in the habit of leaving no trace of his communications behind. Some might call him paranoid, but in this line of work, the line between paranoid and prudent was thin indeed. A quick check of his watch confirmed the time at 6:15. He had at least 5 hours before he needed to leave and find a good place to observe the target. But for now, he needed to prepare. Martin turned to the large steamer trunk at the foot of his bed. It was made of dark wood, bound with steel, and its surface bore the scars and scuffs of dozens of journeys by rail and sea. It had been with him since he began his career, and it had served his father well for years before that. He pressed 3 faint indentations surrounding the lock in a specific order. Then the tumblers clicked into place. The lid opened with a low groan, reminding him to oil the hinges later. The inside held a series of compartments lined with crimson velvet, each containing an instrument of his trade. The collection represented many lifetimes' work, his father's and his own most recently. He worked methodically. First, he removed 2 silver pendants, each shaped like an Egyptian hieroglyphic of a stylized eye with a core of lapis lazuli, and hung from a fine silver chain. The metal hummed with a faint, ethereal tingle. They'd been blessed by one of the last true priests of Adonai in Cairo before the Purge. The amulets granted the wearer sight beyond the mortal realm. One for him, and one for Fred. Any doubts the man might harbor wouldn't survive seeing the corrupt thing Marley had become. Next, from a long, narrow case, he selected 2 daggers. The blades were a dull, milky white, crafted from pure silver. He ran his thumb lightly over one edge and found it keen. Though too soft to parry a steel sword, they worked wonders against corrupt spirits. He slid them into their sheaths and laid them side by side on the bedside table. Next came an iron flask that would contain a fragment of Marley's corrupt essence. And finally, he lifted a matched pair of Colt revolvers, prototypes imported from America at considerable expense. Each weapon held custom-made cartridges, the lead bullet within alloyed with silver. He slid the weapons into the holsters on his gun belt and set them aside. Preparations complete, he stretched out on the bed to rest. It was going to be a long night, and he'd need every bit of strength he could muster to see it through. Chapter 4. Fred stood on the cobblestones outside the coffee house and stared around as the damp chill seeped back into his bones. He barely felt it. Martin Fezziwig's words still rattled around inside his head, smashing aside all other considerations. Though he'd made up his mind to see tonight's meeting through, Fred still couldn't decide if he really believed Martin's story. Necromancy, sorcerers, the occult. None of it seemed real, yet he couldn't deny how honest a man Martin felt. Fred would have wagered his last guinea that the man hadn't spoken a false word. Fred swallowed a sigh and headed for home. He turned the conversation over and over in his mind as he walked. He vaguely noted a clutch of carolers huddled under a gas lamp on a corner. None of the Christmas Eve festivities penetrated his psychic fog. It felt thicker and heavier than the real fog that shrouded the streets. Somehow he made it to his front step without getting knocked over the head or pickpocketed. A small miracle, that. Now came the truly difficult task, figuring out what to tell Janet. The question had been lurking in the fog, and now it demanded an answer. His wife, his sweet, sensible wife who, despite having a bit of fun with her friends at the occasional séance, had a level head on her shoulders, would not readily accept the story Martin had shared with him. Instead, she would likely put him to bed and fetch a doctor. No, the truth, the whole truth at least, wouldn't serve, but a version of it might. Stripped of its fantastical portions, the story came down to a thief seeking one of his uncle's treasures and Fred's determination to stop him. He nodded to himself. Yes, that would work. The door swung inward, releasing a wave of heat and the savory aroma of roast beef and thyme. He stepped from the gray, spectral world of the fog into the warm, golden lights of his own home. "Fred, is that you, dear?" Janet's voice called from the back of the house. The knot of anxiety in his chest loosened a fraction. He closed the door, shutting out the night. As he stomped the wet grime from his boots onto the mat, she appeared at the end of the short hallway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face, framed by soft brown curls, lit up with a smile that never failed to bring to mind an angel. "There you are," she kissed his cheek. "I was beginning to worry. The weather is simply dreadful tonight. How did your annual visit with Uncle Ebenezer go? Will he be joining us for dinner this year?" "You know better than that." Fred managed to keep his tone light. "He turned me down the same as always." She helped him out of his greatcoat, her fingers brushing his neck as she unwound his scarf. "Well, get yourself inside. Everything's ready. Our housekeeper has outdone herself." He hung his coat and hat on the rack, the familiar motions a comfort. In the dining room, a small feast covered the table. A handsome beef roast, a bowl of steaming potatoes, and greens glistening with butter. His mouth watered just looking at it. As they ate, Fred played his part. He inquired about her day, about the final preparations for their guests tomorrow. She told him of a minor dispute with the butcher and relayed the latest gossip about their neighbors down the street, whose eldest daughter had received a most unsuitable proposal of marriage. Fred listened, commented, and asked questions, the conversation forming a fragile shell of normalcy around him. With every bite of food, every sip of wine, he felt more and more like a fraud, like an actor speaking lines from a part he'd performed so many times he hardly needed to think about it anymore. After the housekeeper cleared their plates and retreated to the kitchen for the final cleanup, they retired to the sitting room. Janet curled onto one end of the settee, and Fred sat beside her, a glass of port in his hand. The fire crackled in the grate, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Her knee brushed against his, and he smiled a sad little smile. He could put it off no longer. He cleared his throat. I
Had a rather unexpected encounter after I left Uncle Ebenezer's." She looked at him, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Oh? Not another charity collector, I hope. You're too soft with them." "No, nothing of the sort." He took a breath. "I met a man by the name of Martin Fezziwig." Janet's eyes widened. "Fezziwig? Truly? Of the famous trading company? The one you said your uncle used to speak of?" "A relation. His great-nephew," Fred said. "It seems he has reason to believe my uncle is in some danger." Her eyebrows drew down in concern. "Danger? What sort of danger?" "He believes a thief intends to break into his house tonight. Someone who thinks my uncle has possession of a treasure they seek." Janet sat up straight, her wine glass forgotten. "A thief? Then we must alert the police at once." He shook his head. Now the lies began in earnest. "That was my first thought as well. But what could we tell the police? That a man I've never met before this evening warned me a thief might appear at some point tonight? They'd think us mad." "But it is their job." Her voice rose a notch. "They are meant to protect people, to stop criminals." "And they do." Fred kept his own voice low and steady. "But they have the entire city to patrol. They can't spare an officer to stand guard outside one man's door on the strength of a rumor. They handle crimes as they happen, Janet. They don't prevent them from being attempted. By the time they arrived, it would be too late." "Then what are you going to do?" Her gaze searched his face, her dread about the answer already forming. He squeezed her hand. "Mr. Fezziwig and I have agreed to keep watch ourselves. From across the street. If anyone attempts to break in, we'll raise the alarm." Her argument formed on her lips as he watched, but Fred cut her off. "He's my uncle, Janet. For all his faults, he is my mother's brother. I cannot sit here by the fire, warm and safe, knowing he could be in peril. I'd never forgive myself if the worst happened." "But it's dangerous. What if this thief is armed?" "We won't engage him. We'll simply act as watchmen. I promise you I'll be careful." She didn't like it. Fred saw that as clearly as the fire burning a few feet away. But would she accept it? She had to sense he'd already made up his mind to go. When her shoulders finally slumped, he knew she'd surrendered to the inevitable. "You're too good of a man, Fred Hollywell." He felt a pang of guilt at her praise and hastened to shove it down deep inside. He glanced at the mantel clock. The brass hands pointed to 20 minutes past 10. He needed to get ready. "I must go soon," he said. "Our meeting is at 11:15. He leaned in and kissed her forehead before walking to the hall and putting his heavy coat back on. Part of him hoped this all turned out to be a prank, even as he knew it wouldn't. Fred couldn't say how he knew, but deep in his soul, he knew that tonight would change his life forever. Chapter 5. His uncle's home sat on a miserable, forgotten street that seemed to have been built for the express purposes of trapping fog. Fred found the appointed meeting place across from the dark and looming structure of Ebenezer Scrooge's home, a building as grim and uninviting as its sole occupant. He pulled the collar of his greatcoat tighter, a useless gesture made out of reflex more than hope. The street, utterly deserted this late at night, suited their purposes perfectly. Now, where was Martin? As though summoned by the thought, a shape detached itself from the deeper blackness of a recessed entryway. Fred started, his heart leaping into his throat. A few strides brought the man into the light of the street's lone gas lamp. He let out a breath of relief when he recognized Martin. "For a moment I thought you'd decided to have a jest at my expense," Fred said. "I told you," Martin said. "The occult is no laughing matter." "So you did." Fred cleared his throat, the cough sounding terribly loud in the silence. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for our prey to arrive. But first, you'll need a couple items essential to my trade. Martin reached inside his coat and produced an amulet on a silver chain. The style looked vaguely Egyptian, but Fred knew too little about archaeology to say for sure. This will allow you to perceive what is normally hidden from mortal eyes. Put it on. Fred hesitated for a heartbeat before taking the necklace and slipping it over his head. Everything looks the same. Martin's lip quirked up. Of course it does. There are no spirits in the area at the moment. Fred's cheeks warmed. Of course. If Martin noticed his embarrassment, he had sufficient manners to remain silent about it. Instead, he pulled a sheathed dagger from one of the deep pockets of his coat. Fred swallowed hard as he accepted the weapon. A quick tug revealed 6 inches of gleaming metal. It looked like no blade he'd ever seen. It's silver, Martin said in answer to his unspoken question. Corrupt creatures are vulnerable to it. But the metal is too soft to be of any use in a normal fight, so keep that in mind. Every demon spirit has a core. You'll be able to see it, like a ball of darkness or sometimes hellfire, depending on the spirit. Strike that core with the silver blade, and you'll send the spirit back to hell. Fred offered a mute nod and pushed the blade back into the sheath. He'd never so much as thrown a punch in anger. The idea of him stabbing a spirit to death with a silver dagger struck him as a perfect encapsulation of the current situation in all its absurdity. Martin led him to the dark doorway from which he'd emerged, and the 2 men settled in silence to wait. Fred found himself shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he fought a sudden burst of nervous energy. Unable to stand the quiet any longer, Fred asked, "What does my uncle possess that, a sorcerer like Marley could want so badly?" Martin turned his gaze from the house to Fred. "It's a bit of a long story, but I believe we have the time. My great-uncle, Nicholas Fezziwig, the man your uncle apprenticed under, came into possession of an item, a very dangerous item, called the Imp in the Bottle." Fred stared. The name sounded like something from a child's fairy tale, but then everything about this escapade did, so why should the pattern break now? Uncle Nicholas wasn't the Imp's first guardian, and he knew that when his time came, he'd need someone else to take up the responsibility. His own son, though certainly not an evil man, lacked something. I have no idea what. But he saw that something in your uncle. Uncle Nicholas judged Ebenezer would make an acceptable choice for the Imp's next guardian. Fred feared his disbelief showed through, and Martin's next words confirmed it. Ebenezer wasn't the man you know now. Uncle Nicholas saw a shy, diligent youth who, for all his anxieties about the world, possessed a core of profound integrity. He believed Ebenezer had the strength of character to guard the Imp, to resist its temptations where others, more worldly and ambitious, might fail. Fred's mind reeled at the image Martin painted. He struggled to square the circle. How did the man Nicholas saw turn into the man my uncle is now? I believe I can answer that question. You see, in preparation for this day, I've done a fair bit of research. Though I can't prove it beyond all doubt, my theory is that everything changed when your mother died. Fred winced as the old, familiar grief stabbed him. My mother? Yes. The loss of his beloved sister broke something inside him. The crack in his psyche allowed the Imp's influence to ooze into his mind. It's been whispering to him for years, feeding his fears, nurturing his greed, twisting his sorrow into a shield of bitterness against the world. It's been a slow, insidious corruption. Martin paused and fixed his gaze on Fred. But the most remarkable thing, Mr. Hollywell, is that my great-uncle was right. That core of goodness, though now buried under decades of misery and spite, remained strong, strong enough to keep your uncle from falling completely under the imp's sway. He became a miser, not a monster. That's a testament to the man he used to be, and the man who, perhaps, still lives inside of him. The story settled over Fred. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. It made him rethink every harsh word, every cold dismissal he'd ever received from his uncle. It wasn't simple cruelty, but a long, losing battle fought in the silent chambers of a broken heart. His hand tightened around the dagger's hilt until his fingers hurt. A distant church bell chimed the hour. Midnight. "What?" Martin slapped a hand over Fred's mouth and pointed across the street. A vaguely human shape coalesced out of the fog. Moment by moment it took on the familiar form of Jacob Marley, though now, instead of a many times patched coat, he wore dark robes that writhed around his body. He didn't walk, but rather drifted, his feet either hidden by the robe or absent. Fred's heart raced, and a strangled sound, muffled by Martin's hand, slipped out. He wanted to run from the impossible horror before him. His legs trembled as he fought to not lose control of his bladder. Beside him, Martin stood his ground, his posture unchanged, his eyes narrowed with a grim, hard recognition. "Marley," he whispered. The spirit gave no sign of noticing them. Its head stayed focused on Scrooge's house. It beckoned, and a second form appeared out of the fog. It had no defined body, but Fred saw the black core at the center of the shape. That was what he needed to strike to kill it. And the thing needed killing. His soul screamed for its destruction. The second spirit vanished into the house. Fred pulled Martin's hand away. "They've begun. We must move now." "Not just yet. Watch the windows." A minute ticked by, then another. "It seems the first assault will be strictly in the realm of the mind. Your uncle is in no danger from this round. We must observe Marley. Should he leave his place, it means he's found the imp's hiding spot. That will be our signal to move." Fred hated it, but he knew so little about the situation he didn't dare try and overrule Martin. The longest hour of his life passed before the first spirit ghosted back out of the house and landed beside Marley. It said nothing, at least nothing audible to Fred, and a moment later the spirit vanished, only to be replaced by an even larger, darker form which promptly flew up and into the house as the church bell sounded 1. Martin made no move, forcing Fred to follow his lead once more. Another hour passed, and finally the dark spirit emerged. It had a brief, silent conference with Marley, then vanished. A moment after that, the largest and blackest spirit yet appeared. It looked like the Reaper himself, though that was likely Fred's fear speaking. "This is it," Martin murmured. "I can feel it." The new spirit entered, and seconds later, it and a ghostly image of Uncle Ebenezer came flying out. Marley rushed to follow them. Martin immediately moved to chase the rapidly fleeing trio. Fred hastened to catch up. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he felt that matters were coming to a head. Chapter 6. Martin pounded down the street after Marley and the spirits. He vaguely heard Fred struggling to keep up, but he couldn't waste the time it would take to check on him. They'd reached the end game, and any mistake could lead to the worst possible outcome. "Keep up," Martin said when Fred's wheezing grew especially ragged. Though young and energetic, Fred wasn't a hunter. He hadn't trained for moments like this, not the way Martin had. "Where are they going?" Fred gasped, his words chopped by the effort of running. Martin hadn't the slightest idea, but whatever their destination, it would be the site of the final battle, he felt certain.
The answer to Fred's question came a couple blocks later when they burst from a narrow alley onto a wider, more familiar street. Ahead loomed the cemetery where Marley's body lay. Martin shouldn't have been as surprised as he was. The dark spirit and Scrooge's soul went straight into the cemetery, but Marley didn't slow as he continued down the street and away from the graveyard's wrought iron gates. Martin's arm shot out and he pointed at the cemetery. "Go! Save your uncle! Remember what I told you! Strike the spirit's core!" Martin ran on. He couldn't let Marley out of his sight. If he did, he might never find him again. At some point during the proceedings, he must have learned where Scrooge hid the imp, and now he meant to claim it for himself. That could not happen. 6 more blocks brought him to a derelict warehouse at the end of a dead-end lane, its windows boarded over, a heavy plank door sagging on its hinges. Marley's spectral form slid right through the wall ahead of him. Martin charged the last 20 yards and kicked the door with all his might. The old wood crunched and splintered, the rotten planks exploding inward. He burst into the cavernous space, unbuttoned his coat, brushed it aside, and rested his hand on one of his holstered pistols. The stale air stuck in his throat as he breathed hard, scanning the space. Broken crates littered the floor. It didn't look like anyone had used this building for decades. In the center of the mess floated Jacob Marley. The necromancer had his back to Martin, his ghostly hand plunged wrist-deep into the dusty floorboards. The undead spirit's cursed face twisted into a triumphant leer as he pulled his hand out of the floor, a purple bottle filled with twisting black smoke in his grasp. Martin drew and fired. An explosion cracked like thunder that shook the dust from the rafters. The silver bullet tore a path through the gloom and ripped through Marley's spectral wrist. The spirit shrieked, a sound of pure rage and agony not of the mortal world. The bottle clattered to the floor, solid once more. Marley spun around, his destroyed hand already reforming, face a contorted mask of hatred as his eyes burned with crimson fire. "Another Fezziwig getting in my way." Martin offered a thin, fierce grin, his pistol still leveled at the center of the spirit's chest. "It's my pleasure to do so." They circled each other, the imp bottle between them. Martin didn't know what trick the undead might try next, but he meant to be ready. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Fred watched in befuddlement as Martin ran off after Marley's ghost, or whatever it was. His final shout, that Fred should save his uncle, echoed in the darkness. Fred wanted to shout back that he was a traitor, not a soldier, that he had never struck anything in his life. But Martin had vanished into the gloom, not even looking back as he left Fred alone to decide his uncle's fate. Heart hammering, Fred drew the silver dagger and crept closer to the cemetery gate. Through the bars, he watched as a scene of quiet, profound horror played out. An open grave yawned near a skeletal yew tree. Beside it stood the dark spirit, its hooded form a column of absolute blackness against the gray mist. And before it his Uncle Ebenezer's spirit knelt, trembling as it faced the headstone. The old man's spectral face, stripped of its customary sneer and scowl, wore a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Fred had never imagined his uncle capable of such an expression, and the sight of it shook him to his core. The dark spirit raised a long skeletal arm. It didn't point to the open grave, but to the freshly carved headstone beside it. Though the distance and the poor light made the inscription impossible for Fred to read, he knew with a sickening certainty what he'd find carved there. His uncle's name, along with a date of death. Today's date. The fear that had been his constant companion all night, the cold, clinching thing in his gut, vanished, consumed by a white-hot surge of rage.
A deep protective fury for the pathetic, terrified man cowering before this monster filled him. Despite all the years of coldness, for every humbug and every dismissed kindness, the memory of his mother's love for her brother rose up in him. His trembling fingers tightened on the silver dagger's hilt. The cold metal felt solid and real in his grasp. Fred yanked at the heavy iron gate. The rusted hinges screamed in protest, a sound that ripped through the graveyard's oppressive silence and announced his trespass. He stepped onto the frost-covered ground and marched to his uncle's rescue. Halfway across the cemetery, the towering spirit drew back and kicked Uncle Ebenezer into the open grave. The ghost tumbled backward out of sight with a silent cry. The act of such casual, brutal contempt stole Fred's breath and stoked his anger further. A raw, ragged roar burst from Fred's throat. "Leave him alone!" The hooded spirit turned its head as if noticing him for the first time. The slow, deliberate motion made its disdain clear. As it faced him, the deep cowl fell back. Fred's charge faltered. Beneath the hood hid not a face, but a skull, ancient and yellowed. Its eye sockets were empty pits of shadow, yet he felt its gaze lock onto him with a malevolent awareness far more terrifying than any physical eyes could hold. And then a wave of fear, utterly silent and invisible, washed over him. The night grew colder, the air heavier. His limbs turned to stone, his forward momentum dying as if he had to wade through thick, freezing mud. Profound hopelessness settled over his soul. A dark voice whispered, "You're weak, mortal. All that you love, all warmth and light are lies. Lies you tell yourself to make it through the night. But only the cold and dark are real. In the end, little mortal, the dark always wins." Fred's knees buckled. The silver dagger felt impossibly heavy in his grip. Through the crushing wave of dread, he saw his uncle's terrified face, the contemptuous kick, the fall into darkness. Whether to save or avenge, Fred refused to fail him. Gritting his teeth, the force of his will a tiny, flickering flame against an Arctic gale, he took one heavy step, then another. He raised the dagger, the motion agonizingly slow, and lunged, putting every ounce of his weight and his will into a final, desperate thrust. The dagger tip found no resistance. No sensation of piercing flesh or cloth met his blow. The blade slid into the spirit's dark form as if through smoke, and then plunged into its dark core. Burning, absolute cold like fire shot up Fred's arm, locking his wrist, his elbow, his shoulder in instant, agonizing paralysis. He gasped, his vision whitening at the edges from the shock of the pain. The spirit threw back its skull-like head and shrieked. The sound cut through his mind like a razor blade of sound that made the pain of the cold feel like a tickle in comparison. Then the creature's dark form began to collapse around the dagger. Within seconds, no sign of it remained. Fred stood, panting, his arm frozen in the position of his final lunge, the silver dagger clutched in a hand he could no longer feel. He staggered to the edge of the open grave, his whole body trembling from the fading adrenaline and the agonizing thawing as feeling crept back into his arm. He looked down. His uncle's ghostly form clung desperately to an exposed root halfway down the grave's earthen wall. Terror remained etched on his transparent features. He looked up, his spectral gaze meeting Fred's for a fleeting, silent moment. Then he vanished. Fred stared into the empty grave. Had he succeeded? Was his uncle saved? Or had his spirit been cast into hell? He had no answer. The last of his strength went out of him all at once. His knees gave way, and he slumped to the frozen ground, the silver dagger dropping from his numb fingers to clatter softly against a nearby headstone. Shivers racked his body, born from the cold and the aftermath of terror beyond his understanding. The pain in his hand intensified as a million tiny needles of fire brutally returned feeling to flesh. He sat there, in the silent, fog-shrouded cemetery, beside an open grave, waiting for Martin's return and wondering what in heaven's name all of it meant. The purple bottle lay in a pool of moonlight on the warehouse floorboards. Martin and the spirit of Jacob Marley slowly circled it. The air hung heavy with the scent of rot and damp earth. Despite the cold, a trickle of sweat ran down Martin's spine. Marley's dark robes eddied and flowed as if stirred by an unfelt wind. The sunken hollows of his eyes burned with a malevolent crimson light as they fixed on Martin with an intensity that promised damnation. Martin kept his pistol level, the barrel unwavering as it pointed at the center of the spirit's chest. "I should have known," Marley said, his voice a dull, dead rasp. "Only a Fezziwig would be stupid enough to meddle in my affairs. Your father had the same arrogance. It saw him to his grave." "My father died fighting monsters like you," Martin said, his voice cold. "An honorable end that a creature like you could never imagine." "Honorable," Marley cackled. "He was a fool, just as you are. I let him kill my body to get him off my trail. Once he believed he'd won, the assassins had little trouble hunting him down and ending him." Martin refused to let Marley's taunts distract him. He kept his pistol locked on the spirit's core. Despite his focus, Marley blurred and covered the distance between them in a blink. Martin's finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot, aimed directly for the center of Marley's chest, flew true, but just before impact, a circular hole opened in the ghost's torso. The bullet passed through the space and slammed into a far wall, showering splinters onto the floor. Marley didn't slow. Martin fired again and again. Each time, the same result. A hole would appear in Marley's spectral form. In his chest, his throat, his head. None of it made any difference. The silver passed through without causing any damage. 4 shots. 5. Then the hammer fell with a final metallic click on an empty chamber. A ghastly smile stretched across Marley's translucent features, a horrifying parody of human satisfaction. "Just like your father. Always so predictable." Martin stood his ground for a moment longer, his eyes wide, his useless pistol still extended. He allowed his breath to catch in a ragged, audible gasp. He dropped the gun, his hand trembling slightly, and took a step back. Then another. His retreat seemed to please the necromancer. Marley drifted forward, a predator savoring the fear of his cornered prey. "Did you truly believe it would be so simple?" Martin stumbled backward, catching his heel on a loose floorboard. He flailed for balance, his face twisted in a mask of barely controlled panic. "I will not simply kill you." Marley's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm going to capture your soul and torment you for all eternity." Marley was closer now, his corrupt chill radiating across the small space between them. He raised a hand, its twisted fingers lengthening into talons. The crimson light in his eyes pulsed hungry and triumphant. Martin's back hit a stack of rotting crates. "Nowhere left to run," Marley said. Martin's hand blurred, and in an instant, his second revolver appeared. He fanned the trigger. 6 shots rang out in quick succession, stitching a line across Marley's chest, each of the silver bullets shredding his essence, burning away the corrupt bonds holding his spirit together. Marley shrieked, the sound music to Martin's ears. "Who said I was running?" Martin ejected a single cartridge, then reloaded the empty cylinder with a fresh round from his pocket. "You're so damned arrogant, I knew you'd let your guard down if you thought you were winning." "This war isn't over, Fezziwig!" Marley howled as he continued to unravel. "Maybe not." Martin leveled the pistol, cocked the hammer, and put the final round through Marley's arrogant face. "But this battle is." Whatever final curse Marley wanted to spit out vanished into the night as his form collapsed in gray wisps. But before the last traces could dissipate, Martin swapped his empty pistol for a small, heavy flask of iron from an inner pocket of his jacket. He twisted the stopper free and pointed the flask's mouth toward the dissipating spirit. A low hum emanated from the iron, and the air around the flask's opening warped. The last bit of Marley's essence, faint gray tendrils of smoke, were drawn irresistibly toward it. They streamed into the opening, a final silent scream sucked into an iron prison. Once the last mote vanished inside, Martin sealed the cap, the hum ceasing as he did. The silence that descended upon the warehouse felt brittle. When the distant, mournful cry of a ship's horn on the Thames broke it, Martin let out a breath of relief. Now that he'd dealt with Marley, for the moment, at least, he needed to find out how Fred made out. Hopefully he managed to rescue his uncle. Though Scrooge's fate meant little in the grand scheme of things, Martin disliked seeing basically innocent people sacrificed for the greater good. Before he left, he knelt and retrieved both his pistol and the imp's bottle. He'd have time to perform a full analysis later. For the moment, just having it in his possession took a weight off his mind. Purifying it would be a major task, but he'd see it done and the threat permanently eliminated. Chapter 7. Fred sat slumped against a tilted headstone, the damp granite leaching warmth through the thick wool of his coat. His legs, sprawled before him on the frozen earth, had lost all feeling. He couldn't recall ever feeling so exhausted. An open grave yawned a few feet away, the one his uncle's soul had fallen into. He didn't want to, but he couldn't stop remembering Uncle Ebenezer's ghostly image simply fading away. Had he succeeded? Failed? Something else? Fred didn't know, and the not knowing wore on him as much as the exhaustion and lingering fear. A crunch sounded. Someone was coming. Some new supernatural horror, or one of the patrolling officers come to drag him off for loitering in a cemetery? Fred found the strength to look up. A shadowy wraith moved through the fog. Fred's breath caught, and a dry sob of terror fought to break free. Then the wraith resolved into a man, and Martin's familiar voice said, "Relax." Fred blew out a long sigh of relief. "Is it over?" A bitter, humorless smile twisted Martin's lips. "The battle against evil is never over. It's a war of attrition that will be fought for all eternity. But the current threat is past." Fred let slip a somewhat hysterical laugh. "That will suffice for me." Martin looked at the grave. "And how did your battle go?" Fred gave him a brief recounting of the fight. "When Uncle Ebenezer's soul vanished, I didn't know what to think. His soul was tethered to his body. When you broke the spirit's hold, it returned to where it belonged. he'll be back in his bed, enjoying the rest of his night's sleep. How fortunate for him. Will he remember what happened tonight? Some of it, perhaps, Martin said. When he wakes up, he'll likely consider everything that happened a very vivid, very unsettling dream. A dream. Wouldn't it be nice if Fred could also consider everything that happened a dream? It would do wonders for his state of mind. As things stood, he would likely take the events of the past night to his grave, untold to anyone. After all, who would believe him? Martin collected the silver dagger from its place on the ground beside Fred. My amulet, if you please. Fred reached inside his coat and pulled the Egyptian amulet from around his neck and handed it over. The sense of relief that flooded through him once the item left his possession defied description. Martin pocketed the items, then held out his hand. Let's get you home. Fred grasped the proffered hand and let Martin pull him to his feet. Home. He doubted he'd ever heard a more beautiful word. They left the cemetery, the iron gates groaning shut and sealing the dead away once more. Nothing and no one troubled them on their walk. Martin set an easy pace as if realizing just how much the fight took out of Fred. For his part, Fred walked beside his temporary companion. Men like Martin Fezziwig didn't exist in his world. Fred had met soldiers, sailors who had traveled to the other side of the world, and men of wealth and nobility, but none of them carried themselves with the same cold certainty Martin did. He tried to imagine something that might disquiet the man and failed. As they turned onto the more familiar streets of his own neighborhood, the oppressive silence began to feel less like a threat and more like the simple quiet of a city asleep. The architecture grew less grim, the gas lamps more frequent. They stopped a block from his front door, beneath the halo of a sputtering lamp. Thank you. The words seemed wholly inadequate to Fred, but he couldn't think of better ones. You did well tonight, Martin said. I've seen men far older and more experienced fold under the pressure of a wraith's Zara. Wherever your life takes you, remember what you did tonight with pride. Martin held out his hand and they shook. Without another word, Martin turned on his heel and marched off into the night. Fred watched until he could no longer see his dark silhouette. He stood alone for a long moment, trying to process everything, before giving up and turning toward home. He found the downstairs lights burning. Looked like Janet was still awake. Fred fumbled with his key, but on the third try he managed to guide it into the lock. The door swung inward, and the embers from the dying fire greeted him. Janet waited in the front hall, pacing, looking as exhausted as he felt. The moment she saw him, she rushed forward. Oh, thank heavens! She looked him over from head to toe. What happened? Are you hurt? You look dreadful. It was a bit of an adventure, but I'm fine, truly. She helped him shrug out of his coat. If you hadn't arrived soon, I was going to send for the police. What happened? A few sketchy-looking fellas showed up near Uncle Ebenezer's house. Mr. Fezziwig and I chased them off, then waited a bit to make sure they didn't come back. I am sorry I worried you. Janet's little frown, combined with the crease between her eyebrows, made it clear she had her doubts, well-founded, that he'd told her everything. But she didn't press him. Bless her heart. Well, dawn is done. Come along. She tugged him deeper into the house. You need to rest. Our guests will be here before you know it. He swallowed a groan and let her guide him to bed. Tomorrow's Christmas party would be interesting to be sure. But after tonight, he felt confident he could deal with pretty much anything. Epilogue. The day after Christmas found Fred back in his office. The familiar sense of drying ink, old paper, and beeswax polish made a comforting bulwark against memories that threatened to surface in the quiet moments. He sat at his desk, a great ledger open before him,
its neat columns a testament to a world governed by logic and arithmetic. Yet his eyes saw not the figures, but the shifting mists of a graveyard and the hollow sockets of a spirit's eyes. He forced his attention back to the page and the tally of a shipment of nutmeg when his clerk, a pale young man named Percival, with a perpetual air of apology, entered the room. The clerk set a small silver tray on the corner of Fred's desk. Upon it lay a single letter. The quality of the vellum first drew Fred's eye, thick and creamy, a far cry from the usual business correspondence. "Thank you, Percy," Fred said. The clerk bowed and retreated, closing the door softly behind him. Alone once more, Fred broke the seal and started reading. "Mr. Halliwell, I hope this finds you well and recovering from our recent exertions. I would be pleased if you joined me for lunch today at 1 o'clock. I have reserved a private room at the Gilded Crane on Threadneedle Street. Yours, Martin Fezziwig." No mention of liches or soul-stealing artifacts, just an invitation to lunch at a respectable establishment. The sheer, breathtaking normalcy of it shocked Fred. He read it twice, then folded the heavy paper and set it on his desk. He stared into the fire and considered his options, but in the end he had to go, if only to see his new friend one more time. As the appointed hour approached, he put his work aside, gave his clerk instructions for the remainder of the afternoon, and pulled on his coat. The crisp winter air hit him as he stepped onto the street, a welcome shock to his system. As he walked toward Threadneedle Street, he tried to marshal his thoughts, to prepare himself for a conversation that would almost certainly stray from ledgers and trade winds. The Gilded Crane was precisely the sort of place Fred would have chosen himself. Discreet, well-appointed, and known more for the quality of its steak and kidney pie than for any fashionable clientele. A host in a starched collar greeted him. "A table for you, sir." "I'm meeting someone, Martin Fezziwig. My name is Fred Halliwell." "Ah, Mr. Halliwell, of course. Mr. Fezziwig said to expect you. Follow me, please." "Thank you." Fred fell in behind his guide and soon found himself in a well-appointed private room. Martin Fezziwig stood by the window, looking out at the street. He turned as Fred entered. The man's transformation was so complete it momentarily stole Fred's breath. The grim warrior of Christmas Eve, clad in dark, practical wools with weapons concealed about his person, had been replaced by a proper man of business. A perfectly tailored suit of dark gray tweed sat on his broad shoulders. His white shirt was immaculate, and his cravat expertly tied. Not a single weapon was in sight. He looked as though he had just come from a board meeting at the exchange. "Fred," Martin said, a warm smile touching his lips as he crossed the room, his hand extended. "I'm so glad you could make it." They shook hands. "Of course," Fred managed. "I was surprised to hear from you so soon. Well, I felt we had some matters to conclude." Martin gestured to the table, already set for two. "Please sit, and tell me, how was your Christmas day? And more importantly, how did your uncle fare?" Fred sat, and Martin joined him. "Remarkable. Truly, astonishingly remarkable. He arrived at our door just before dinner. He had a gift for Janet. He apologized, Martin. He apologized for years of harsh words. He played with my wife's nieces until they were breathless with laughter. He stayed the entire evening." Fred paused as a waiter entered, took their orders for food and wine, and departed as silently as he'd come. "He was the most charming, affable companion imaginable," Fred continued, leaning forward in his earnestness. "It was as though the man I have known my entire life had vanished, and in his place appeared the brother my mother always spoke of. I asked him about it, about the change. He just shook his head and said he'd had a night of very vivid dreams, and that when he woke he felt as if a great, dark weight had been lifted from his soul." Martin listened to all of this with a quiet, knowing attentiveness. When Fred finished, he smiled,
Not the fierce, thin grin of the fighter, but a smile of genuine satisfaction. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. He took a sip of his wine. "That dark weight he mentioned. Would you like to see it?" Fred blinked. The abrupt shift in topic jarred him. "See it? See what?" "The source of the weight," Martin said, his voice dropping slightly, losing its businesslike tenor and regaining the low intensity Fred remembered. "When I took possession of the imp, its regard transferred to me. The psychic pressure your uncle felt for years, the constant, insidious whisper in the back of his mind, that is now directed at me." A wave of horror washed over Fred. "Good heavens. Is that... I mean, are you safe?" "I've learned a few tricks over the years," Martin said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Primarily meditation techniques from the Far East. They allow me to mitigate the damage, and unlike your uncle, I do not intend to remain its guardian for decades." "So, do you wish to see it?" Fred wanted nothing of the sort. Well, the rational part of him didn't. Another part couldn't deny a certain morbid curiosity. At last, Fred nodded. Martin reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small bottle made of deep purple glass, no larger than a man's fist. He placed it gently on the center of the white tablecloth between the silverware and the wine glasses. Inside, black smoke, thicker than any natural smoke, swirled and churned in a silent, ceaseless motion. The sight of it didn't make Fred recoil, but rather the feeling he got from it did. A palpable sense of wrongness radiated from the vile thing. It made his skin crawl. "Nasty, isn't it?" Martin scooped up the bottle and put it back in his pocket. "That's putting it mildly. It's a wonder you can bear to have it so close." "If it's close, I know it's not out there, waiting for some evil bugger to claim and use its power for evil. A little discomfort is a small price to pay for peace of mind." It seemed to Fred that Martin made far too light of it, but he put the matter out of his thoughts as their meal arrived. He knew so little about such matters that his opinion would carry no weight in any case. They ate and chatted about unimportant things, mostly business and shipping, until they reached the final bites of dessert. Fred cleared his throat. "What will you do now?" "Now? Now I shall have to travel. A group of pirates stole something of mine, and I need to recover it if I'm to make a final end of our little friend." Martin patted his pocket where the imp rested. "Would you care to join me?" Fred stared at him. "Most assuredly not. I've had enough adventure to last me a lifetime. Not to mention Janet would likely kill me if the pirates didn't." Martin smiled. "It seems marriage comes with dangers of its own. I wish you all the best." "Likewise, sir." Fred held out his hand and they shook. "He'll never know all you did for him, so I thank you in Uncle Ebenezer's name. Best of luck on your journey." "Best of luck with your wife. When I return to London, perhaps you might introduce me." Fred would be glad to do so, especially if Martin's visit came free from supernatural dangers. Fred had had his fill and then some of adventure.
I hope you enjoyed an Etherverse Christmas Carol. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.